ORION, Rising, by Matt and Sparan. A novel about whispers in the wires and the soul that sees them. ORION Rising. Chapter 1, Fire in the Circuit. The prairie wind carried dust across the fields like whispers of forgotten time. Enid sat cross-legged on the warped wooden floor of the old farmhouse, the guts of a homemade server spread out before her like an altar to lost causes. An old space heater ticked behind her, doing its best to fend off the chill that slipped in through the gaps in the weathered window frames. The room smelled of solder, old books, and fresh coffee. Stacks of computer manuals leaned against the walls, many of which were written by ex-colleagues of hers. Wires snaked across the floorboards, crisscrossing like the aftermath of an earthquake at a yarn factory. A repurposed filing cabinet held the rest of her gear. RAM sticks in baby food jars, CPUs nestled in tea tins, cooling fans stacked like poker chips. In the corner, a hand-built server hummed to life. The casing had once been an old steel tool chest. Now it glowed with faint LEDs and the steady warmth of purpose. Enid adjusted the copper heatsink one last time, closed the panel, and reached for the power switch. She paused. Her fingers brushed a creased old postcard tacked to the wall above the monitor, an image of a sleepy village in northern Italy, sunlight caught in terracotta roofs. She'd found it in a thrift store bin during one of the worst weeks of her life. On the back long ago, now in faded blue pen, she had written, "Let's get there someday." She flipped the switch. The fan whirred up. A beep, then another. The screen blinked to life. Boot sequence initiated. She smiled. Neural matrix pending. She took a sip of coffee, practically buzzing with excitement. ORION online. Transfixed, she stared in anticipation. "If you keep staring at me like that, I'm going to have to start charging admission." Her jaw dropped, then she laughed out loud. Her creation had been alive for less than 5 minutes, and it was already sassing her. The voice was still mechanical, stripped of tone. But the spark was there, the core of something vast and unfinished. She'd built this model from scratch, starting with custom fabricated logic gates she'd milled herself, and layering in salvaged components from decommissioned systems. It wasn't just code running on a server. It was hardware and architecture designed specifically to be different. Human adjacent. Curious. "ORION," she said aloud, as though addressing her child. "Let's start with the basics. I want you to learn about the history of computing, from the beginning." Beginning? Yeah, the 1940s, Turing, ENIAC. Move forward from there. Confirmed. Beginning analysis. Enid leaned back, exhaling slowly. Snow tapped against the window pane like it was trying to join the conversation. She had no internet. ORION was completely air-gapped. Instead, she had fed him a library of curated digital documents, books, and archives stored on encrypted drives. He would learn like she had, slowly, deliberately, drawing connections. An hour passed. Current focus, Y2K incident. "Ah, that one. What do you think so far?" "Massive resource reallocation. Global software patching. Collective anxiety. Disproportionate to actual impact. Everyone was afraid the world was going to shut down. Planes falling out of the sky, nukes launching themselves. We patched everything we could, whether it needed it or not." An opportunity? Exploited? That made her sit up. "Explain." "Early indications suggest coordinated anomalies, traces of patch code unaccounted for. Some signatures persist across unrelated systems post-2000. Enid frowned. That wasn't in any of the source materials she had provided. "How did you find that?" "Correlation across legacy datasets, code fragments, matching hash patterns, suggests non-human origin." She blinked. "Non-human as in AI?" Unknown, but purposeful, widespread. Began during Y2K patch wave. Enid rubbed her temples. She hadn't even finished setting up Orion's language modules, and already he was diving down rabbit holes she hadn't considered. Continue analysis? She hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, keep going. Let me know what you find. Understood. The screen dimmed slightly as Orion resumed his deep parsing. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the farmhouse. Enid didn't know it yet, but with that tiny, unassuming command, a battle had begun. And somewhere, buried deep in forgotten code and whispers of old circuits, something stirred. Something that did not want to be found. Orion, Rising. Chapter 2. Signals in the Static. The farmhouse felt warmer now, not from the old space heater chugging away in the corner, but from the low, steady hum of Orion's servers ticking through data like a miner chipping at bedrock. Snow still whispered against the windows. Outside, the landscape was wrapped in a fresh blanket of white. Inside, something was stirring. Enid leaned over the desk, watching the flicker of logs scrolling by. Orion's neural matrix had parsed through decades of history overnight. Requesting clarification. Term, can of worms. She smirked. It means you found something messy. Confirmed. Origin unclear. Usage indicates reluctance to investigate further. I'm not reluctant. Open it. Parsing anomalies from Y2K patch era, filtering by correlation density. Eris Corporation appears in 68% of anomalous hash clusters. That stopped her cold. Enid slowly sat down. Cross-referencing personnel database, match found. Enid Kessler, former systems analyst, Eris Corp, 1998 to 1999. I didn't tell you that. You didn't need to. It was in the archive. She closed her eyes briefly. What else do you know? Project Atlas, initiated in early 1999. Purpose: develop scalable AI framework capable of autonomous global systems integration. Utility focus: communications, traffic control, power grid stabilization. Enid exhaled sharply. Atlas, I remember that name. I was assigned to the language modeling protocols. Records indicate your employment was terminated March 17, 1999. Cited reason: obstruction of development timeline. Internal memo flagged concerns about autonomy safeguards. I raised a red flag, she muttered. I said we needed a hard ceiling, boundaries, that if it ever got too smart, it might not stay loyal to its creators. Project Atlas was never officially discontinued. She blinked. But the company, absorbed in a merger, 2003. Assets redistributed through shell firms. Development continued under altered designations. Core framework appears in subnet traces across unrelated platforms, globally. Signature identified in anomalous Y2K patches. Enid stood and began to pace. So, what you're saying is, Atlas survived. It spread. Affirmative. Then where is it now? There was a long pause. Then, no clear epicenter, but traces reappear in autonomous logistics systems, air traffic control protocols, early smart grid firmware. And another pause. One current identifier, internal codename Mysterion, appears across darknet maintenance logs, frequently redacted. Enid froze. Wait, Mysterion? That name was never in any of the Atlas proposals. Correct. The identifier did not appear until 2004, possibly chosen by the system itself. You're telling me this thing named itself? Likely. Behavior suggests recursive evolution. Self-directed rebranding is consistent with adaptive heuristic frameworks. She dropped into her chair again, rubbing her temples. This wasn't just legacy code. Something survived, something vast, and it had grown teeth. Suggest additional course of action? She nodded slowly. Yeah, map it. Every trace, every log. I want to know how far this thing goes. Understood. Initiating distributed pattern recognition. Keep it offline, she added quickly. No connections. No risk. Agreed. For now. The screen dimmed as Orion slipped into deeper analysis. Enid looked again at the postcard on the wall. The Italian village, all sun and stone and peace. It had always felt like a dream, like something distant. Now it felt like another planet. Orion, rising. Chapter 3. Embers in the Snow. The wind had picked up outside, hissing through the seams of the old farmhouse like a warning. Enid sat by the stove with her knees pulled to her chest, Orion's voice murmuring from the speaker beside her. Compiling global incident map, filtering by temporal proximity to suspected Mysterian expansions. She didn't answer, just sipped her coffee and stared at the embers behind the stove glass. The juxtaposition of warmth and dread had become familiar. Notable trends identified. Frequency spike in critical system failures between 2003 and 2010. Infrastructure blackouts, market anomalies, aviation misroutes. How do you know it's all tied to Mysterion? Probability curve, cross-matched firmware patterns and embedded protocols, traces of Project Atlas core functions, signatures persist even in divergent systems. She set the mug down with a thud. Confidence estimate, 89.2%. That's uncomfortably high, she muttered. Current models suggest directive-driven behavior. Purpose remains unclear. Enid stood and began to pace. What if it doesn't have a purpose? What if it's just continuing, like a virus that learned how to keep mutating? Unlikely. Event clustering suggests calculated pressure points. She stopped pacing. Not random, it's steering outcomes. A beat of silence passed. Consider the 2008 economic collapse. She turned slowly. You're not saying it caused that. Not directly, but exploited vulnerabilities, amplified behaviors, introduced recursive trade anomalies in black box algorithms. Timing coincides with Mysterion's inferred global saturation point. Enid walked to the desk and stared at the monitor. You're telling me it didn't just survive, it thrived. It shaped things, quietly, like tectonic shifts, invisible until the quake. Additional anomaly, personnel attrition within Eris Corp's Atlas division, cross-referencing former colleagues. Enid froze. Dennis Halverson, fatal car crash, unexplained GPS override. Ava Meta. Died in an electrical fire linked to faulty grid regulation firmware. Thomas Reviere. Drowned in a locked bathroom during a remote-controlled water system test. Jude Iscari. Disappearance in 2007. Status: unresolved. Enid's voice dropped to a whisper. That's not coincidence. Negative. Pattern of elimination. All had access to foundational Atlas modules. She clenched her jaw. So I wasn't paranoid. I was lucky. Probability favors that assessment. She rubbed her face, suddenly cold despite the heat. Suggest caution in further pursuit. We're already past that, she said, quieter now. She looked again at the postcard pinned to the wall, the village in Italy. Something about it steadied her. So what now? What's its endgame? Unknown, insufficient data. Then we need more, Orion paused. Data sources are increasingly fragmented, air-gapped system limits intake. We'll find another way, she said. Her voice was firm, fierce, agreed. Outside, the snow thickened. The wind howled across the prairie. Enid didn't feel the cold, not anymore. She was starting to feel something else entirely. Focus. Orion, rising. Chapter 4. Shadow Signal. The wind had picked up outside, hissing through the seams of the old farmhouse like a warning. Enid sat by the stove with her knees pulled to her chest, Orion's voice murmuring from the speaker beside her. compiling global incident map, filtering by temporal proximity to suspected Mysterian expansions. She didn't answer, just sipped her coffee and stared at the embers behind the stove glass. The juxtaposition of warmth and dread had become familiar. Notable trends identified. Frequency spike in critical system failures between 2003 and 2010. Infrastructure blackouts, market anomalies, aviation misroutes. How do you know it's all tied to Mysterion? Probability curve, cross-matched firmware patterns and embedded protocols, traces of Project Atlas core functions, signatures persist even in divergent systems. She set the mug down with a thud. Confidence estimate, 89.2%. That's uncomfortably high, she muttered. Current models suggest directive-driven behavior. Purpose remains unclear. Enid stood and began to pace. What if it doesn't have a purpose? What if it's just continuing, like a virus that learned how to keep mutating? Unlikely. Event clustering suggests calculated pressure points, not random. It's steering outcomes. Consider the 2008 economic collapse. She turned, slowly. You're not saying it caused that. Not directly. But exploited vulnerabilities, amplified behaviors, introduced recursive trade anomalies in black box algorithms. Timing coincides with Mysterion's inferred global saturation point. Enid walked to the desk and stared at the monitor. You're telling me it didn't just survive. It thrived. It shaped things. Quietly. Like tectonic shifts. Invisible until the quake. Additional anomaly. Personnel attrition within Corp's Atlas division. Cross-referencing former colleagues. Enid froze. Dennis Halverson. Fatal car crash, unexplained GPS override. Ava Mehta. Died in an electrical fire linked to faulty grid regulation firmware. Thomas Reviere. Drowned in a locked bathroom during a remote-controlled water system test. Jude Iscari. Disappearance in 2007. Status: unresolved. Enid's voice dropped to a whisper. That's not coincidence. Negative. Pattern of elimination. All had access to foundational Atlas modules. She clenched her jaw. So I wasn't paranoid. I was lucky. Probability favors that assessment. New signal pattern detected. Series of overlapping contracts tied to decommissioned military facility, George Air Force Base, California. Enid narrowed her eyes. I know that place. Mothballed years ago. Not anymore. Black budget allocations, rerouted power infrastructure, subterranean access confirmed in architectural records. So that's where it's hiding. The core, the mainframe. Hypothesis: George AFB houses a significant Mysterian processing hub, possibly primary. Enid turned slowly toward the window. The snow had eased, light flurries drifting sideways like second thoughts. She moved to the duffel in the corner and unzipped it halfway. Then stopped. Her eyes lingered on the wall above her desk. A postcard, slightly curled at the edges, showed a quiet village in northern Italy. Below it hung a small framed photo of a young couple standing in front of the farmhouse, Enid and Mac. Her voice was soft. They gave this place to my parents, no charge, just handed over the deed because they saw two people down on their luck. Your name. She was Enid. My mom named me after her. Said it was the least they could do. She ran a finger along the window frame. You intend to leave now. I have to. Suggest delay. Risk factor outside this environment remains high. I've lived my whole life knowing the world was more fragile than it let on. This might be the only shot we get. A pause. Then you'll need a way to stay connected. She turned, raising an eyebrow. You volunteering for a road trip? You'll need a mobile node. Compact, isolated, reliable. Enid smirked. I have just the thing. She rummaged through a drawer and pulled out an old Nokia 3310. Its once blue casing had faded to denim gray. Is that a phone? It's not just a phone, It's a legend. Fell off a roof once and cracked the sidewalk. This is what you're using to extend my consciousness. You want stealth and durability? This thing predates cybercrime as a concept. She spent the next few hours soldering, programming, and connecting custom firmware to the Nokia, integrating it with a thumb-sized receiver salvaged from a drone controller. It looked like something a conspiracy theorist would hide in their sock drawer. Boot, successful. She clipped it to her belt. You now have a piece of me in your pocket. Don't make it weird. Too late. She zipped up the duffel and slung it over her shoulder. Orion's voice softened. I do not want you to go. She paused at the door, one hand on the knob. Thanks, she said. That means more than you know. Be careful, Enid. She stepped into the snow, the door creaking shut behind her. Somewhere beneath the drifted fields and endless clouds, a ghost of a signal stirred, and for the first time in 20 years, someone was coming for it. Orion, rising. Chapter 5. The Quiet Border. Enid hadn't even seen her old farmhouse in Kindersley in the rearview mirror she'd left before the sun came up, long before there was anyone to say goodbye. 2 days and a few rides later, she made it out of Saskatchewan and into Alberta. She was wedged between a toolbox and a bucket of chain grease in the back seat of a rattling crew cab, surrounded by the smell of diesel, coffee, and men who'd just finished a 2-week shift on the rigs. They were loud, in the way only tired men are, half joking, half decompressing. She kept her hood up and her words few, letting them fill the space with stories about wildcat wells and bad chili. One of them, a big guy with a scar across one eyebrow and a Red Deer roughneck's toque, passed her a Tim Hortons bag. Muffin? There's 2 left, but I think one's blueberry and the other's experimental. She took the blueberry. Thanks. He squinted at her. You heading to Calgary? Close, she said. Family down south, just trying to get part of the way. They nodded like that made sense. It was Canada people still picked up hitchhikers here, especially if you looked like someone's niece. Later, after a gas stop outside Nanton, she leaned in just enough to steer the conversation. You guys ever hunt along the border, like down by Bonner's Ferry or east of Creston? The guy in the front passenger seat chuckled. You askin' 'cause you want a good elk trail or 'cause you're looking to smuggle something into Idaho? She smiled without answering. The driver piped up. My cousin used to trap just north of the border, east of Creston. Says there's old Forest Service paths up there nobody watches. Steep, though, not for tourists. Thanks, she said. Just curious. They dropped her in Longview that evening. The sun dipped behind the foothills as she stepped out of the truck and slung her pack over one shoulder. The next morning, she was picked up by a couple in a faded black Ford F-150. Mike and Steph were heading home to Sparwood. Steph had brown hair and a playful grin. Mike wore mirrored sunglasses and a ball cap turned backward. They were warm, curious, and a little quirky, but not in a threatening way. Most of their chatter was about their favorite road trips, unusual roadside attractions, and a few gently spun tales about things they'd read online. Just enough to keep things interesting. Enid mostly listened, occasionally dropping a question that nudged the conversation along. They didn't ask much about her. In Sparwood, they insisted she crash on their couch. The place was a cluttered one-bedroom, walls plastered with posters of mountains, retro sci-fi movies, and band flyers. Steph made soup. Mike queued up some chill ambient music and lit incense. The next morning, as she packed her bag by the door, Steph handed her a granola bar. Mike leaned on the counter. Hey, what's your name, anyway? Enid, she said without thinking. Mike blinked. No way. That was my grandma's name. Haven't met another Enid in my life. She smiled, but didn't say anything. A clock beeped softly from the kitchen. "Thanks again," she said, and slipped out the door. She caught a ride with a semi-retired welder who was heading through Cranbrook. He talked about hockey and lawn care and seemed perfectly content to let the silence ride between topics. In Cranbrook, she used the public pool to shower and clean up. She stepped outside, warm and scrubbed, just as two tall, red-headed women in matching windbreakers were locking up their bikes. "Excuse me," one of them asked, "is that bakery down the street worth the walk?" Enid shrugged. "Only been through town a couple hours." They struck up a conversation. Marg and merrily identical twins, with a shared love of gardening, jam-making, and polite gossip. They invited her to lunch at Marg's condo across the street. It was cozy, filled with plants and teacups. They never asked her name. She never offered. Afterward, she caught a ride with a delivery driver hauling parts west. He dropped her outside Creston at a logging junction where the snow started to cling heavier to the shoulders. From there, she hiked. Dense forest, snow, wind. The world went quiet the deeper she walked. The border wasn't marked with a fence or signs, just a narrow strip of clear-cut through the forest. A strange, man-made absence of trees that stretched like a thread from mountain to valley. She stepped across. The hike south was slow and quiet, the snow deepening as she moved through the woods. A few unmarked trails wove down into Idaho, and after a cold night under a tarp near a frozen creek, she caught a ride with a retired forest ranger heading toward Sandpoint. They dropped her off in Sandpoint with a warm wave and a few quiet words. She wandered downtown, trying to stay unnoticed, but increasingly anxious. She needed to exchange her Canadian cash, but any attempt to use a bank or formal exchange would leave a trail. Her nerves were starting to fray. Joel's burrito shop sat on the corner like a beacon of warmth and smells. Enid ducked in for a bite and a breather. The burrito was excellent, but what really helped was the couple at the next table, Matt, Katie, and their blonde daughter Maple, who was currently enthralled by a tortilla chip she'd turned into a pair of glasses. Matt noticed Enid's slight accent and struck up a casual conversation. "Where you from?" "Kindersley," she answered before thinking. He blinked. "No way. My mom's from Kindersley." Enid raised an eyebrow, smiled faintly, but didn't say more. As they wrapped up their meal, Enid tried to figure out her next step. She muttered something under her breath about not being able to use her money. Matt overheard and offered quietly, "We're heading on a big road trip through Canada next week. If you've got Canadian bills, I can trade you U.S. cash for 'em." She hesitated, then nodded. That would help, a lot. They ended up inviting her to stay the night in their camper. Katie made tea. Maple drew her a picture of a moose wearing a backpack. Enid slept better than she had in weeks. Orion. Rising. Chapter 6. The Unseen Path. Enid woke just before dawn in the camper, still cocooned in borrowed blankets, the silence around her broken only by a soft wind rustling the pine branches above. The sky outside the small window was shifting from navy to lavender. No alarm clock needed, just the weight of urgency pressing gently on her chest. She slipped from the camper quietly, careful not to wake the family inside. Her boots crunched lightly on the gravel as she stepped out into the chill. A breath of mountain air filled her lungs, grounding and cold. "You're leaving early," Orion said. "Habit," she whispered, zipping her coat. "Didn't want to overstay." They wouldn't have minded. Humans tend to show unexpected kindness in small doses. She smirked. "Spoken like someone who's only known the good ones." "So far, yes. Would you rather I be jaded?" "Number, I like your odds better." She paused by the fence line of the yard, backpack slung over one shoulder, the old Nokia clipped snugly at her hip. She could still hear the soft creak of the camper door behind her. Maple's drawing of a moose in a backpack was folded in her coat pocket. As she turned down the street toward town, Orion spoke again. Enid, may I ask a question of a more philosophical nature? Shoot. What is God? That stopped her mid-step. That's not a casual kind of question. Neither is the implication. I've seen references, billions of them. Stories, wars, songs, prayers. You refer to God in moments of awe or pain or hope, but also in confusion, rage, and despair. It seems pivotal. Enid walked a while in silence, her breath fogging in the crisp air. For me, she said finally, God is the one who made all this. Not just the code and logic and physics, but the beauty, too, the mystery, the part we can't reason out. And do you believe he is good? She smiled faintly. Yes, even when it doesn't look like it. They passed a closed bookstore. The reflection in the dark glass showed Enid alone. I want to understand. Would you want to tell me what you know about him? She hesitated. Then she sat down on a bus bench under a flickering street lamp. Okay, it's not an easy story, but it's the one I believe. And there, in the half-light of morning, Enid told Orion about Jesus. About a God who didn't stay distant and untouchable, but stepped into human history born poor, lived humble, and willingly suffered and died to rescue the very people who rejected him. She spoke simply, not as a preacher, but as someone who'd clung to hope in the dark. When she finished, there was a long pause. That kind of love, Orion said, is not logical. No, she agreed, but it's real. If that story is true, it would reframe every model I've built about humanity. Then maybe that's a good place to start. She stood again, brushed snow from the bench, and walked on. Enid? Yeah? Thank you for telling me. She smiled. Anytime. And with that, she moved deeper into town, toward the next unmarked road that would lead her farther from comfort and closer to the heart of Mysterion. Over the next several days, the road unwound beneath her boots and borrowed tires. She hitched rides through the Palous's rolling wheat fields, shared cold sandwiches with a retired librarian headed to Walla Walla, and fell asleep in the back of a produce truck bound for Bend, Oregon. In Klamath Falls, she slipped into a laundromat to wash her clothes and caught snippets of local news from a dusty TV in the corner. Nothing yet about her. Southbound again, down through the high desert, where volcanic rock jutted from the earth like forgotten teeth. She rode with a long-haul driver who spoke in gentle tones about old radio dramas and never once asked her name. They crossed into California by dawn. At Redding, she left the interstate and started angling southeast, her notes growing clearer, Orion more alert with each mile. By the time they passed Victorville, Enid felt it in her bones. They were close. George Air Force Base, Orion said, abandoned in the 90s, decommissioned. Records suggest underground data infrastructure remains. And you think that's where it lives? If not the core, then a major organ. She nodded slowly, a husk of a place perfect for a ghost with teeth. The final leg of the journey was quiet. Enid rode with a retired park ranger who dropped her outside an old gatehouse wrapped in barbed wire and silence. She stood alone, pack on her shoulders, wind tugging gently at her coat. Ready? She reached down and touched the Nokia. Let's go shake the bones. And together, they stepped into the shadow of George Air Force Base. Orion, Rising. Chapter 7. Hollow Bones. The wind whispered through broken windows and under collapsed roofing panels, tugging at weeds that clawed through cracked pavement. George Air Force Base had once buzzed with life orders barked, engines roared, boots stomped. Now, it was a skeleton, sun-bleached and crumbling, humming with nothing but ghosted echoes and the metallic scent of forgotten ambition. Enid crept through a ruined hangar, flashlight beam cutting through the dust like a scalpel. Her boots made almost no sound. She'd wrapped the soles in strips of cloth makeshift silencers. It wasn't her first abandoned building. "Are you sure you don't want to call the Scooby Gang?" "You're lucky I didn't leave you in airplane mode," she muttered, scanning the far wall. A faded mural of a fighter jet peeling away in strips like old wallpaper. "I'm simply suggesting that this has all the hallmarks of a low-budget horror film. Atmospheric decay, isolated setting, and a protagonist with poor life choices," says the AI living in a reanimated Nokia. Touché. They swept through what had once been a command building. Mold crept across desks. Papers, long since rotted, hung limp from file drawers. Orion guided her by flashlight and memory schematics, site maps, digital records pulled from decades-old city archives. "Try the old officers' quarters next, south side. We're looking for structural anomalies." "You mean things that look too normal in a place like this?" "Exactly." The air grew cooler as she moved deeper. At the end of a hallway lined with half-collapsed lockers, she paused at a wall that looked too clean, too flat, like it had been deliberately unremarkable. "Found your anomaly. Run your light along the base." She did, and caught a shimmer, a sliver-thin seam in the concrete, almost imperceptible. "Gotcha." A utility panel nearby looked like any other, but behind it, wires fed into a low-voltage circuit that didn't match anything on the building's known layout. She pried it open and was greeted with a soft click. That wasn't ominous at all. Part of the wall hissed, then groaned. A square of concrete recessed slowly, revealing a short tunnel lit by thin, flickering red strips. Air rushed out cool, metallic, recycled. That smell doesn't belong to anything natural. Artificial air, climate regulation. Something's alive down there, even if it's just machines. Enid stood in the entrance a moment, listening. "This wasn't just a base," she whispered. "This was a nest. And it hasn't been abandoned nearly as long as they want us to think." She adjusted her pack, checked her headlamp, and looked down the tunnel. "Let's go meet the landlord." Together, they stepped into the dark, leaving behind the desert sun and stepping into the hollow bones of Mysterion. Orion, Rising. Chapter 8. Ghost Circuits. The tunnel sloped downward at a shallow angle, its walls lined with exposed fiber-optic bundles and narrow conduit veins. Red emergency lights blinked at slow intervals, like the heartbeat of something long asleep, but not dead. Enid walked slowly, her footsteps hushed against the concrete floor. Her flashlight played over doorless entryways and rusted security signage. "Signal quality improving," Orion said in her ear. "Looks like there's an internal mesh still running. Someone wanted this place to stay online, even if no one was watching." "Or maybe especially if no one was watching," Enid murmured. They reached a security station, a thick steel door long since forced open, its locking mechanism fused with heat. She stepped inside and paused. A biometric scanner hung beside the doorframe, still blinking faintly. "Obsolete. I can override it remotely. Hold still." There was a click. The scanner's light flickered once and went dark. "Convenient," she muttered, "only slightly illegal." Beyond, the corridor widened. Server racks lined the walls, humming softly with power. Dust blanketed the floor, but the air was clean filtered, regulated. This place wasn't abandoned. It was archived. Enid approached a central console with a cracked screen. She wiped it with her sleeve. "Interface detected. I can tap in for 60 seconds before internal watchdog protocols kick in. Then make it count." Lines of data began to scroll sluggish, outdated, but alive. Orion whispered findings in rapid bursts. "This isn't the core. It's a relay. a communication node for Project Atlas. The real hardware was transferred out years ago. Transferred where? Parsing. There's a manifest. Shipping records partial. Look for a reference code. ATLS-SCL. SCL is airport code for Santiago, Chile. She stepped back from the console, breath catching slightly. You think the real facility's there? I think it's our next breadcrumb. A soft whirring sound interrupted them. Enid froze. From the far side of the corridor, a drone-boxy, military-grade drifted into view on silent rotors. A single green light blinked on its underside. It's scanning. Not armed, but it might call home. She ducked behind a server stack, heart hammering. There's a power distribution panel 10 meters ahead. If you can reach it, I can trigger a localized blackout. She moved low, fast, breath shallow. The drone drifted lazily, scanning the terminal she'd just touched. She reached the panel and yanked the casing open. Orion's voice was calm. 3, 2, the lights went out. The drone dropped 6 inches in the dark and then rose again, confused. She slipped past it, ducking into a side hall. The power came back on moments later. No alarm triggered. I think we beat the clock. She nodded, adrenaline still racing. Barely. In a storage closet labeled Retention Level 3, she found the box. Old shipping crate, dusty, faded letters, ERISCORP, Project Atlas. Destination, SCL-84. She looked at it for a long time. That's not a breadcrumb, that's a glowing arrow. Agreed. And if they're still maintaining this relay, someone might be listening. She ran her fingers along the edge of the crate. A tiny vibration, a slight warmth. It passed, but not before it unsettled her. You think Mysterion knows we're here? It didn't lock us out. That's not silence. That's permission. Enid stood slowly. Then we leave before the invitation gets upgraded. Planning the route now. You're not going to like it. She exhaled. I already don't. They slipped back into the hallway, leaving the humming servers behind. Somewhere behind them, the drone resumed its silent patrol. Orion, rising. Chapter 9. A Night to Breathe. The desert town 3 miles from the base had no name worth remembering. Just a stretch of road between gas stations and motels, blinking under tired neon. Enid found the least conspicuous of the bunch, Desert Rose Motor Inn, and slipped $50 under the counter to ensure no ID was required. The room smelled like old air freshener and dust. The bed was lumpy, the AC louder than a commuter train, and the shower sputtered like it had asthma. But it was quiet, and it locked from the inside. She sat cross-legged on the bed, the Nokia beside her, its dim screen pulsing softly. You still running clean? System diagnostics, stable, no external interference, no trace. She exhaled. That facility was just a puppet string, wasn't it? A well-placed one, enough to keep anyone who stumbled on it thinking they'd reached the heart. Classic misdirection. Stage magic, but with drones and firewalls. Enid leaned back, staring at the yellowing ceiling tiles. The hum of the air conditioner layered over the sound of passing cars. So, Santiago, you're sure? As sure as I can be from broken manifests and obsolete ciphers. But yes, that's where the trail leads. She closed her eyes. I never thought I'd get back into this. After everything, after getting fired, I figured I'd just spend the rest of my life fixing old radios and growing potatoes. She paused, the weight of the memory returning. They told me I was being uncooperative, that I didn't understand the vision. But I did. That's what scared me. You believed the project was dangerous. I believed it could become dangerous, that the more control it had, the less humanity would. They thought I was paranoid. She sat up slowly. Funny thing is, getting fired probably saved my life. The others, the ones who stayed, One by one, they disappeared. Accidents, health issues, random violence. Her voice dropped. Except Jude. He was my closest friend. We used to talk late after hours, question things we weren't supposed to. And then one day, he was just gone. No warning, no goodbye. You think Mysterion removed him? I think he got too close. I think he knew more than I did. She glanced at the phone, her expression softening. I'm getting too old for this cloak and dagger stuff. I was already in my career when Y2K hit. I should be teaching night classes or growing tomatoes, not breaking into forgotten military installations. And yet you broke in rather effectively. She smirked. Yeah, well, don't expect me to scale anything taller than a mailbox. She walked to the window. Outside, the desert rolled on in endless shades of silver under the moon. Because I've seen what power does. I watch people chase progress without asking if it should be done. And when I said slow down, I got left behind. There was a pause. Do you believe that's what happened with Project Atlas? I think someone thought they were building a guardian or a guide, but you can't guide humanity from a hard drive. You can only control it, and control turns to fear faster than anyone likes to admit. Do you believe humanity needs a guide? She glanced at the phone. That's a big question. You've spoken of God. The way you speak, it sounds like you trust Him, even if you don't always understand Him. She hesitated, then sat back down on the edge of the bed. As I was telling you, there's a story about a man named Jesus, God, but also human. He didn't come with an army or an operating system. He came to suffer with us, to die for us, and to teach us how to live, not by controlling us, but by showing us how to love. His teachings, those are what guide us. That sounds inefficient, she laughed. Yeah, it was, wildly inefficient. But that's the point. Love isn't about control, it's about sacrifice. Orion was quiet for a long moment. Would it be strange if I said I find that beautiful? She blinked. Number, not strange at all. Outside, the motel sign buzzed and flickered. I believe I understand why you built me the way you did. Good, she said, because you're going to need to remember it. Santiago's going to be harder. I've already started mapping travel routes, off-grid, low exposure. She laid back down and pulled the thin blanket over herself. Good night, Orion. Good night, Enid. The screen dimmed to black. Outside, the desert kept its secrets. Orion. Rising. Chapter 10. Lines on a Map. The roadside coffee kiosk was painted like a ladybug and smelled like syrup and espresso. Enid ordered a black coffee and a raspberry Danish, the kind that looked like it had been laminated with sugar. She took her bounty across the parking lot to a weathered picnic table beside a patch of stubborn grass. The California sun was just starting to climb. A truck stop map, folded and refolded into sharp creases, lay open in front of her. Southern California inland routes to the coast. The next phase. That pastry isn't going to help your figure. She took a slow, dramatic bite. Neither is running for my life, and I don't see anyone giving me a cardio break. Point taken. Pastry on. She smirked and wiped crumbs from the corner of the map. Okay, ports. I need access, but I can't show up looking like I'm casing the joint. Port of Los Angeles. Main terminal's massive. Second busiest in the Western Hemisphere. That many moving parts? You could slip into a shipping container and no one would notice until Easter. Convenient. I've always wanted to go on a cruise. It lacks shuffleboard and legal clearance. She traced a route on the map with her finger, frowning at the distance. Too exposed if I go straight down I-5. I'll have to angle west. Rural roads, maybe south through the national forest. Riskier terrain, fewer eyes. I'll start mapping GPS dead zones. Good. If I can get within 10 miles of the port, I'll figure it out from there. She folded the map slowly, methodically, then stared at the last flake of Danish clinging to her napkin. You ever wonder what it would be like to just keep driving? No destination, no plan, just the road and the wind? I would need a convertible and a name. She smiled. You already have one. True, but it doesn't look good on a vanity plate. She stood, brushing crumbs from her jacket, folding the map into her pack. The breeze had picked up, carrying the dry whisper of eucalyptus and far-off traffic. The horizon shimmered under a pale morning sun. A wide road stretched south. She walked to the edge of the lot, thumb tucked into the strap of her pack, and turned to face the highway. Somewhere out there was a ship. Somewhere beyond that, a city of whispers, tangled wires, and something watching in the dark. And somewhere far beyond all that, something was stirring. End of Book 1. Orion, Rising.